A family lost their dog 5 years ago. Then one day he showed up. If you told me a week ago that I'd be standing under a moonlit sky, trembling from head to toe, tears streaming down my cheeks, calling the name of a dog I had once loved so fiercely it nearly broke me to lose him, I would have laughed in your face. After all, it had been 5 long years, 5 birthdays, 5 summers, 5 cold Christmas mornings spent recalling the one missing presence that once warmed my entire world. I had given up hope, truly, fully, in the darkest corners of my heart, convinced I would never see him again. But sometimes, the past has a funny way of showing up on your doorstep when you least expect it. My story begins with an ending, in a sense, the end of a routine family life that was irrevocably altered one warm July afternoon. I was 17 years old when my parents took me to a bustling, chaotic animal shelter. I had begged for months, as a teenager begs for a new phone or a trip with friends. I didn't even care what breed it was. I just longed for a warm, furry companion, a friend to help fill that space in my heart as my older brother had just left for college. Our home had felt so empty without his loud music, his sarcastic jokes, and his unwavering presence. The moment I spotted the caramel-brown puppy with bright, inquisitive eyes peering at me through the chain-link fence, it felt as if the universe itself had whispered in my ear, "This is the one." He had one ear that flopped a bit lower than the other, as if he couldn't decide whether he wanted to stand tall and proud or remain shyly drooping. I remember standing there, pressed against the metal enclosure, calling softly. The puppy watched me, tail wagging in uncertain arcs, as though he desperately hoped I was there to save him. I knew in that instant we were meant for each other. We adopted him on the spot. A few hours later, as we were driving home, he curled onto my lap, panting softly in the afternoon heat, and I decided his name would be Milo. It suited him perfectly, playful, bright, and a little mischievous. Over the years, Milo grew from a timid shelter pup into the kind of dog that could bring a smile to anyone's face with a single wag of his tail. He became a fundamental pillar of our family's daily life. My mother adored him. She'd scratch him behind his ears as she sang along to oldies in the kitchen. My father, a strict man who rarely indulged in frivolities, was no match for Milo's gentle gaze. More than once, I found them dozing together on the couch on lazy Sunday afternoons. I loved him fiercely. When I was down, he picked me up with his unwavering devotion. He'd lay his head on my lap, gaze up at me with soft brown eyes, and I'd feel seen, comforted. When I came home from school with tears in my eyes because I'd fought with a friend or had my heart broken, he was there. When my grandfather passed away, Milo lay across my bed, pressing his warm fur against me like a living blanket that shielded me from the chill of grief. He was more than a pet. He was a steadfast companion in a world that often felt unpredictable and cruel. And then, the unspeakable happened. 5 years ago, during a winter that was cruel in more ways than just the icy temperature, Milo vanished. There was no warning, no clues left behind. We woke up one morning and the backyard gate was ajar. The latch was broken, probably from a gust of wind or a stray raccoon rummaging through the garbage. Somehow Milo had wandered off into the pre-dawn darkness. We plastered flyers everywhere, on telephone poles, in local shops, near the post office, and on every street corner. We called every shelter, every vet clinic, every rescue group in a 50-mile radius. We scoured the web and posted pleas on social media. Days stretched into weeks, and not a single person reported seeing a dog that matched Milo's description. It was as if he had evaporated into the winter air. The first few nights, we left our bedroom windows open, hoping that if he was wandering nearby, he'd catch our scent and come home. But the brutal cold only bit at our faces, reminding us with every shiver that our dog was somewhere out there, alone, frightened, or worse. We walked the streets calling his name. We explored the woods behind our house with flashlights, stepping over brittle twigs, hearts pounding every time an animal in the underbrush. but each expedition ended in disappointment. I can't remember the last time I sobbed that hard. It felt like losing a piece of myself. Months bled into years. Eventually, hope began to dim, flickering like a candle's final flame. People told us maybe he had been stolen, or maybe he was found by another family who never saw our flyers. We slowly packed away his toys, storing them in an old cardboard box in the attic. Life went on. I graduated from high school, moved on to college, and tried to bury the grief beneath the demands of my new life. But every so often, usually in the quiet moments before sleep, I'd remember that warm body curled up against my legs, the bright gleam in his eyes whenever we'd play fetch in the backyard. I'd recall the rough texture of his tongue when he'd greet me with doggy kisses after a long day, and I'd wonder, did I do enough? Was I careless? Could I have prevented his disappearance somehow? Guilt is a pernicious weed. It takes root in your heart and refuses to let go, no matter how many times you try to pull it out. Despite my parents' encouragement to find closure, I never fully did. No matter how many times life moved forward and placed new experiences in my path, a small spark of hope lingered. It stayed in the background, like a quiet hum you only notice when everything else is silent. That was how it was for 5 long, excruciating years. Then, last week, everything changed. I came home to visit my parents for a weekend. It was meant to be a brief trip, just a chance to relax and catch up. Mom was grilling on the back porch, Dad was replanting his tomatoes, and I was sitting at the kitchen table, looking through old photo albums for fun. Mom keeps hundreds of pictures in meticulously labeled albums, pictures from family vacations, birthdays, random Tuesday nights where we all just happened to look joyful. And of course, pictures of Milo. It started out as a sweet nostalgia trip. Flipping through the pages, I would smile at the images of a younger me hugging a fluffy puppy, or an older me playing tug-of-war with a handsome, grown dog. Then, inevitably, my heart clenched with that familiar grief. I decided to close the album and help Mom with the marinade for the chicken. Mom had barely commented on it, just gave me a rueful nod, because we both knew how painful those memories could be. Instead, she changed the subject by saying, "Grab me the paprika, would you?" So I did, and that's when we heard the barking. Low, rumbling, tentative at first, but coming from right out front. We froze. Because for a moment, just one breathless instant, we heard that bark and both thought the same improbable thought. Milo. We hurried through the house, stepping around Dad's boots, nearly tripping over the doormat as we yanked open the front door. A scruffy, scrawny dog stood under the oak tree in our yard, its ribs pressed against a dirty, matted coat. Flecks of mud or maybe old burrs clung to his legs, tail drooping low in a mixture of exhaustion and apprehension. He looked up at us, eyes reflecting the glow of the sinking sun. And that was the moment that changed everything. Something in his gaze, some intangible spark, sent lightning through my entire body. Hope burned hot and desperate in my chest. I whispered, "Milo." My mother clutched my arm. We didn't dare move any closer at first, uncertain if the dog would bolt. It took a few seconds, or maybe a lifetime, but the dog's tail gave a hesitant wag. He sniffed the air, his eyes flicking back and forth as though trying to recall an old memory. Without a second thought, I stepped off the porch and approached slowly, my breath hitching with every step. My heart hammered so loudly, I was sure the neighbors 3 doors down could hear it. I stretched out my hand. As soon as I was near enough for him to catch my scent, he pressed his nose against my fingers. In that brief second, I felt electricity run through me. It was as though we both recognized something so familiar, yet so distant. "Milo, oh Milo," I sobbed, collapsing onto my knees in the grass. I didn't care that my jeans were staining, or that tears had started rolling uncontrollably down my cheeks. The dog, my dog, leans into me, tentatively at first, as if he was unsure if this was real. Then he rested his head on my shoulder, a small whine escaping his throat. It was the same whine he used to make when I took too long getting him his treats. My mother stood behind me, one hand covering her mouth, the other clenched into a fist at her side, as if she needed to physically hold herself together. She took a shaking step forward, gently touching the dog's back. He sniffed her hand, whined again, and licked her palm. That was all the confirmation we needed. In that whirlwind of emotion, I realized my father had come around from the backyard. He stood on the porch, eyes wide, face pale as though he were seeing a ghost. "Dear God," he whispered. He took off his work gloves, letting them drop to the porch floor. Then he stumbled down the steps, kneeling beside us to stroke Milo's ears, those same ears that never quite matched in height. We clung to one another, our arms encircling the dog that, for half a decade, we believed we'd lost forever. It felt miraculous, impossible, yet it was happening right in front of me. The dog wore no collar, and his fur was matted and dirty, covered in scratches and small scars. Immediately, practical concerns should have crowded in. Was he hurt? Was he dehydrated? Would he need urgent veterinary care? But in that moment, we simply cried tears of relief, pressing our faces into his ragged neck fur, enveloped in disbelief and gratitude. We brought Milo inside, and I watched him as he sniffed around the living room. He moved like a stranger reacquainting himself with a long-lost home. He walked gingerly, almost on tiptoe, peeking at the furniture, the corners of the room, as if trying to piece together memories from a life that felt half forgotten. He moved towards his old dog bed, still there in the corner where we'd left it, even though it served more as a memory shrine than a bed these days. He circled it once, twice, then lowered himself onto it and closed his eyes, releasing a heavy sigh. It was like the final puzzle piece falling into place. I sank onto the floor beside him, my mother and father hovering close, and we just watched him breathe. Our lost dog had come home. But as the hours ticked by, the relief gave way to urgent questions. Where had he been these past 5 years? Had someone taken him? Had he been wandering aimlessly? How had he survived? We'd never know for sure, not without a voice to explain it all. But in every scratch, every scar, every worn-down paw pad, there were unspoken stories of survival. Milo's eyes seemed older, sadder, as if he'd seen parts of the world none of us could imagine. And behind that sadness there was a wariness, a subtle distrust. It wasn't of us. He recognized our smells, our voices, the shape of our hands. But it was as though the world he had inhabited for so long had taught him to be cautious, to hold onto fear as a shield. He'd never had that look before. It broke my heart. We decided to do what we could to help him heal. We gave him a warm bath. That was an emotional moment, too. At first, he squirmed and yelped, probably from shock or the sting of water on old wounds. But eventually he settled in the tub, letting me scoop water over his back, letting Mom lather the gentle dog shampoo through his fur. We peeled away clumps of mud and bits of debris caught between his toes. Dad stood at the door, passing us warm towels and administering gentle strokes to Milo's head whenever Milo whimpered in discomfort. By the time we finished, his fur had regained some of its softness, though it was still patchy in places, and we could see the rawness of his physical journey. We wrapped him in a large towel, and I carried him to the kitchen where Dad had laid out warm blankets and a dish of water. The moment Milo's tongue lapped at the bowl, a fresh wave of tears threatened to spill from my eyes. The sight was so heartbreakingly normal, just a dog drinking from his water dish in a sunlit kitchen, and yet it felt extraordinary. By the time he'd finished drinking, Milo's eyes drooped in exhaustion. I crouched beside him, massaging behind his ears, whispering, "You're home now, you're safe." Over the next few days, a delicate dance played out in our house. Milo would sometimes startle at sudden noises, like when the neighbor's car backfired in the driveway or when the phone rang unexpectedly. His old exuberance, the unbridled joy that once fueled endless games of fetch, was overshadowed by caution. Still, beneath all that, I could see glimpses of the dog he once was. When I patted my lap, inviting him up on the couch, he gave a hesitant wag of his tail before climbing up next to me and resting his chin on my knee, just as he used to. In those moments, I felt the old bond ignite, a fierce wave of love that reminded me of the day I first brought him home from the shelter. My mother, who could never keep her hands still when she was worried, cooked up a storm. Chicken broth, warm oatmeal with bits of meat, softened dog treats. She made sure he had vitamins and gentle pills from the vet. We went for a quick visit to the local veterinarian's office. Thankfully, it was the same clinic we'd used years ago. The vet was stunned to see Milo, especially after all this time. She ran blood tests, gave him a thorough physical examination. Aside from being severely underweight and having some minor infections in his paws, he was in surprisingly good shape. His heart and lungs sounded strong, no signs of chronic illnesses. It was practically a miracle. But the world doesn't simply hand out miracles without consequences. Word began to spread in our small town that Milo was back. Neighbors and old friends came by, curiosity shining in their eyes. They marveled at him, praising his resilience. Some even joked that we should put his story in the local paper. But underneath the chatter, an uneasy question lingered. How did he find his way back after so long? And why now? A few days after Milo's return, as I was strolling down our street with him on a leash, a battered pickup truck pulled up beside us. It was a neighbor from a few blocks over, the older man who ran a small engine repair shop. He peered at me through the open window, calling out a greeting. Then he squinted at Milo, who was sniffing around the sidewalk. "That your dog?" he asked, voice rough from decades of cigarette smoke. "Yeah," I answered, all pride and relief. He was lost for 5 years, but he found his way back somehow. The man tapped his steering wheel thoughtfully. "Heard about that. Surprised me. But I swear I saw a dog just like him rummaging around the garbage near the edge of town a few months back. Tried to call him over, but he ran off." My heart hammered at his words. It was the first clue of sorts that Milo had been nearby at some point, fending for himself. "Thank you," I said, voice trembling with both gratitude and an undercurrent of guilt for not having found Milo sooner. "I'm just glad he's home now." As the truck rumbled away, Milo pressed close to my leg, his tail giving a small wag. It felt like we were sharing a secret, the two of us. I scratched the spot between his ears, whispering, "What happened to you out there?" He just looked at me with those deep, soulful eyes, silent but knowing. At night, nightmares sometimes plagued him. I woke up more than once to hear him whimpering or pawing at the sheets. Each time, I rushed to his side, gently stroking his fur until he settled. Those nights were long and weighed with sadness. I could only guess at the horrors he had experienced, sheltering under abandoned buildings, scrounging for food in dumpsters, running from bigger dogs or callous humans. Every time I thought about it, my chest ached. I'd snuggle him closer, wishing I could erase the pain from his memories. I promised him again and again that he'd never be alone like that. Ever. My father also struggled with guilt, though he tried to hide it. One evening, I heard him pacing in the living room after he thought everyone else was asleep. When I peeked in, Milo was dozing at his feet, and Dad was staring at old photographs spread across the coffee table. Pictures of Milo as a puppy, pictures of me dancing with him in the yard, pictures of Dad giving him treats. Dad rubbed his temples as though trying to massage away the sorrow. When he noticed me, he gave a tight smile, tears glistening in his eyes. "I should have found a better latch," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I should have done more." I knelt beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Dad, you did the best you could. We all did." He looked down at Milo, who stirred in his sleep, and nodded slowly, swallowing hard. I realized then how Milo's disappearance had torn into every member of my family, leaving a wound that had never truly healed. Maybe that's why his return, miraculous as it was, felt as raw as it did joyful. All the emotions we'd bottled up over 5 years were spilling out in wave after wave of relief, guilt, confusion, and immense gratitude. Each day, Milo's confidence grew. He started to follow me around the house the way he used to, letting the tip of his tail brush against my legs. He took tentative interest in his old toys, especially the squeaky stuffed duck that used to be his favorite. I had kept it stored away in a closet, unable to bring myself to give it away. The day I brought it out, he approached it slowly, sniffing before clamping it gently between his jaws. The squeak sounded, loud and shrill, and he yelped in alarm, dropping it instantly. I giggled at the startled look on his face, tears of relief mixing with my laughter, because it was the first playful moment I'd seen from him since his return. He wagged his tail cautiously, then picked the duck back up, squeaking it a few more times. He brought it over to me, placing it in my lap as he used to when he wanted to play. I laughed in delight, ruffling the fur on his head, his reflection of curiosity and excitement stirring warmth in my chest. Then came the incident that shook us all and nearly tore open the freshly healed wound of Milo's homecoming. It was a Wednesday afternoon, one of those bright, sunny days that doesn't hint at trouble. I was in the backyard, painting an old bench Dad had built years ago, while Milo roamed the grass, sniffing blossoms and chasing the stray butterfly. I was so absorbed in my work that, at first, I didn't notice the black SUV pulling onto the curb in front of our house. I only looked up when Milo began growling softly. I walked to the fence, paintbrush in hand, peering out. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out of the driver's seat. He wore a heavy coat despite the warm weather and had a scowl on his face that set my nerves on edge. He approached our front door, and my father answered, polite but clearly cautious. I watched from the side gate, hesitant to reveal myself until I heard the man's words. "I'm looking for a dog," the man said. "A friend of mine told me someone here claimed a stray that matches the description of my dog who went missing." Instantly, my stomach lurched. The possibility that someone might try to claim Milo as theirs felt surreal. Dad stood firm, crossing his arms over his chest. "Are you sure it's the same dog?" he asked, voice measured. "Our dog came back to us after being missing for 5 years. Do you have any proof your dog is the same one?" The man sighed, pressing his lips together. "I don't have pictures on me," he muttered, glancing around. "But he looks just like the one I had. Same color, same build, everything. I lost him about 4 years ago, found him injured and nursed him back to health. He was with me for a while." My mind raced. 4 years ago. That was a year after Milo went missing. The stories could line up, theoretically. Milo could have crossed paths with this man. But the thought of losing Milo again, right when we'd gotten him back, made my breath catch in my throat. I decided I couldn't remain hidden. I walked through the gate, Milo at my side. The dog hesitated as soon as he saw the stranger, tail tucked, hackles slightly raised. The man locked eyes on Milo, stepping forward too quickly. Milo scrambled back with a startled whine, pressing against my leg. That single reaction told me everything. He was afraid of the man, not excited to see a former caretaker. My father caught it too. He placed a protective hand on Milo's back. "This dog doesn't seem to know you," Dad stated firmly. The man shrugged, shifting his weight. "Maybe he's just nervous." His eyes flickered to the side as he said it, a telltale sign of dishonesty. But I was trembling, terrified that if he fought us in some legal manner, we could lose Milo once again. The man looked from Milo to us, noticing our protective stances, and realized that we weren't going to give him up without a fight. "Listen," Dad said, voice low and steady. "If you can provide any proof, like vet records, pictures, anything, that this dog belongs to you, we'll talk. But if you just heard rumors and decided to stake a claim, you're out of line." Anger flashed across the stranger's face. For a moment I feared he might lash out, but then he let out a frustrated huff. "He's a stray, okay? Found him in an alley years ago. He ran away one day. No big deal." The man's words contradicted his earlier claim of them being missing. I felt a revulsion coil in my stomach. Could Milo have suffered under his care? Could that explain the wariness, the scars? My father and I exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between us. "Look, friend," Dad said, Our dog was missing for 5 years, and we have plenty of records, pictures, vet documentation, family videos of him from well before that. I suggest you leave now." He set his jaw, a quiet threat in his eyes. Dad isn't a violent man, but he'd do anything to protect his family, and that included Milo. The man scowled, then spat on the sidewalk, muttering a slur under his breath. He stomped back to his SUV, fired up the engine, and drove off, tires squealing. My heart hammered in my chest, and it took everything not to collapse onto the grass in relief. Milo stayed close, trembling slightly. I dropped to my knees and wrapped my arms around him, pressing my face into his fur. My father ran a hand through his hair, exhaling shakily. He turned to me. "We need to be careful." We reported the incident to the local police, just to have a record in case the stranger came back. Of course, there wasn't much they could do without more information. But the deputy who came to take our statement recognized Milo from our old missing dog reports. He stood on the porch, tipping his hat, a kind smile on his face. "I remember the day you folks came in," he said. "You must be thrilled he's back." We nodded, grateful for his empathy. He took down the few details we had on the stranger and assured us he'd keep an eye out. The incident shook our household. My mother barely slept that night, pacing from room to room, peeking out the windows, afraid the man might return under the cover of darkness. Dad pretended to be calm, but I noticed him setting a baseball bat near the door. I found myself hugging Milo more tightly, dreading any second that might tear him away from us again. Milo sensed our distress, too, whining softly whenever one of us would walk away or when we locked the doors at night. The ephemeral sense of security that had started to form was now riddled with holes. There was a sense of urgency, of needing to protect our beloved dog from whatever evils he had encountered out there in the wide, brutal world. But days passed, then a week, and the man never returned. Life steadied, returning to a fragile normalcy. Milo grew more relaxed, trusting us again, and sleeping at the foot of my bed like he used to. I'd sometimes wake in the early morning to feel him pressing up against my feet, letting me know he was there. It was comforting, a reminder that the past was behind us. We were forging a new story together. Still, a question lingered in my mind. Had that stranger truly taken Milo in at some point? And if so, what did Milo endure? A part of me wanted to track him down, to uncover the details and finally lay that chapter to rest. But every time I thought about confronting that man, I remembered Milo's trembling, his fear. Sometimes, not knowing the full truth is better for healing. Or at least, that's what I told myself. A week turned into 2, and the aftershocks of Milo's miraculous return began to fade. We settled into a new routine. My parents, who had been planning a retirement trip for the upcoming winter, postponed those plans so they could stay close to Milo until they were sure he was fully recovered, both physically and emotionally. I made the decision to extend my stay at home for another month, finishing some remote work so I could help care for Milo. My heart felt full at the thought of repaying him for all the comfort he'd given me over the years. Slowly, piece by piece, Milo rediscovered his old joys. He started to run in the yard, testing the strength of his legs. He chased a ball across the grass, though he'd tire quickly. He'd find pockets of sunshine and sprawl out on the floor, soaking up the warmth. Sometimes, if we were listening to old music in the living room, he'd cock his head and watch us with that curious puppy-like gaze, as if remembering those days when he'd bounce around to the same tune. It was in those small, simple moments that the enormity of his return felt most beautiful. Then, one quiet Saturday morning, it happened. I was in the kitchen pouring myself a cup of coffee. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting golden rays on the floor, and Milo was lying in that sunbeam. Out of nowhere he stood, walked over to me, and let out a short, excited bark. The bark he used to have when he wanted me to follow him to the backyard for an adventure. I chuckled. "What is it, buddy? You want to go out?" My parents were still asleep, so I put on a coat and grabbed a leash just in case. but Milo bolted through the open door the moment I turned the knob, ignoring the leash altogether. He made his way around the side of the house, nose to the ground, sniffing as though on a mission. Intrigued, I followed. His tail wagged faster and faster. He led me to an old corner of the yard, near a weeping willow tree. It was a spot he used to love as a puppy, digging up random treasures, sticks, old tennis balls, occasionally some squirrels hide acorns. Milo began furiously pawing at the ground. My heart hammered in sudden excitement. What was he looking for? After a minute of frantic digging, he uncovered a dirt-encrusted chew toy, one that had been lost ages ago, one I barely even remembered. He sniffed it, tail wagging, then picked it up and brought it to me. I stared at that toy, brushing off the clumps of soil. It was a neon green squeaky bone, battered and faded from exposure. I knelt down and let Milo deposit it into my hands. Something about the moment felt like a wave of pure, unfiltered joy washing over me. Perhaps it was his way of reassuring both of us that not everything was lost, that some things, even after being buried for years, could be found again. I laughed, hugging him around his furry neck, tears collecting in my eyes. He gave a small whimper of happiness, tail beating a giddy rhythm on the grass. And that's when the tears really started. The realization that this dog, who had survived unthinkable hardships for half a decade, was now choosing to remind us of simpler, happier times. He was bridging the gap between past and present, as if telling me, we can still find the good things we buried. We can still reclaim them. The sense of closure I'd been seeking began to materialize that day. Not because I had all the answers. My questions about his disappearance would likely never be fully answered. But because Milo was showing me that moving forward didn't have to mean forgetting the past. It meant embracing it, scars and all, and still choosing love, trust, and the promise of new memories. As autumn approaches, the leaves in our yard begin to shift from vibrant green to fiery hues of orange and red. Milo took to napping in piles of leaves, nose buried among the rustling shapes. I'd watch him sometimes and wonder how anyone could witness such everyday magic and still doubt that miracles exist. At night, Dad would build a small fire in the backyard fire pit, and Milo would curl at our feet while we roasted marshmallows. The crackle of the flames, the comforting weight of Milo's head on my ankles, and the gentle laughter of my parents felt more precious than any material treasure. We were together at last, and I couldn't help but relish every second of it. Despite the happiness, there was a lingering tension, a worry that this newfound bliss was too fragile. What if Milo decided to run off again? What if that man returned? What if, after all this time, fate still wasn't done testing us? But I tried to silence those doubts, focusing on the warmth of his fur under my fingers. Love so rarely comes without fear. That's just part of the deal. The bravery lies in loving anyway. In an attempt to create a tangible record of our reunion, I decided to film short clips of Milo's daily life. I took videos of him lying in the sun, rolling in the leaves, gnawing on a squeaky toy, and even dozing on the couch next to Dad. My plan was to compile these videos into something we could watch as a family, a digital scrapbook capturing the second life of our beloved dog. My mother watched me do this one afternoon, smiling softly. "I don't ever want to lose him again," she said, tears shining in her eyes. I reached over and took her hand, giving it a squeeze. Time wore on, and as the air turned chill, we celebrated Milo's first Thanksgiving back. We prepared turkey scraps for him, carefully ensuring they were free of bones. My mother insisted on setting a small place for him on the kitchen floor with a special bowl. The four of us, Mom, Dad, me, and Milo, gathered around the table, giving thanks not just for the usual blessings, but for something incredibly rare and extraordinary: the return of a cherished family member who had once been lost. That evening, after dinner, as we lounged in the living room, Milo resting contentedly at our feet, Dad cleared his throat. He rubbed his eyes, his voice trembling with an emotion I'd never quite heard from him before. "I just want to say I don't deserve this second chance. When Milo disappeared, he paused, swiping at an escaping tear. I blamed myself so much. I tried to forget. I tried to move on, but part of me never could. And now he's here, and I just don't ever want to take that for granted again. Mom placed a gentle hand on Dad's arm. "None of us will," she whispered. I swallowed the lump in my throat, fighting back tears. In that moment, the weight of those 5 years seemed to compress and lift at once. We didn't know how many good years Milo had left. Dogs age faster after all. But for every day he remained with us, we would treasure him with all our hearts. Winter arrived with its frosty mornings and twinkling holiday lights. We decorated the house in a flurry of ribbons, wreaths, and fairy lights, as if determined to compensate for all the holiday cheer we'd missed out on sharing with Milo. Snow dusted the lawn and Milo's footprints dotted the white blanket, each print a testament to his presence, to the reality that he was home. We took countless photos, capturing him bounding through the drifts, ears flopping, as though experiencing the wonder of fresh snow for the first time. One night close to Christmas, I decided to sleep on the living room couch, just so Milo wouldn't have to be alone. He'd been getting more comfortable, but sometimes the howling winds rattled him, bringing back memories of being out there in the cold. So I made a little bed on the couch, while Milo snuggled into his old dog bed right next to it. At around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of him stirring. He rose, padding quietly over to me, and rested his chin on the edge of the couch. I cracked my eyes open to find his nose inches from my face, those soulful eyes fixed on me with a kind of questioning warmth. I reached out and rubbed his head. He sighed contentedly and lay down, pressing his back against the couch. I stared at him for a long moment, my mind drifting to the years we spent apart, to the fear and grief that had haunted me. But in that quiet darkness, illuminated only by the glow of the Christmas lights we'd left on by the fireplace, I felt a pure sense of peace wash over me. He was here, and he was safe. My heart pulsed with a gratitude so intense, it took my breath away. I found myself silently praying, thanking whatever benevolent force had guided him back to us. Because that was the miracle I had never dared hope for, the kind of miracle that only existed in tear-jerker movies or sappy articles shared on social media. Yet, it was real, lying right next to me, snoring softly into the night. The holidays came and went in a joyful blur. Friends and neighbors dropped by to see Milo, to pat his head and share in our awe. My older brother visited from out of state, kneeling down to reunite with the dog he had known so well in his youth. "I can't believe it," he kept saying, shaking his head with a grin that stretched from ear to ear. "It's like stepping into a time machine." And then came the day something unexpected and deeply profound happened. It was late January, the sun setting early. A cold front had swept through the region, and the house was cozy with the warmth of the fireplace. I was sorting through some of my old college papers in the living room when I heard a scratching at the back door. At first, I assumed Milo just wanted to go out, but as I opened the door, he darted past me, heading straight for the weeping willow tree. My heart pounded with unease. What was it now? Another buried toy. I grabbed a flashlight and followed him out. The wind nipped at my cheeks, the sky darkening to a deep indigo. Milo stood at the base of the willow, sniffing and pawing. I approached cautiously, shining the light around, half expecting another stray dog or a cat. But there was nothing there. Milo barked, a sharp, urgent bark, then turned to face me, tail low, eyes brimming with a kind of desperation. He pawed at the tree's roots again. Underneath one of the thick, winding roots, something was wedged. I knelt down, raking my fingers through the cold dirt, shining the beam of the flashlight closer. My heart lurched when I caught sight of a small, metallic glint. Carefully, I it loose. It was a collar, Milo's old collar, the one he was wearing the day he disappeared. The once bright fabric was now tattered and the tags were scratched, almost illegible, but I recognized the shape, the color. A cold shiver ran down my spine. How had this collar ended up here, buried under the willow tree? Milo sniffed it, whimpering softly, as if the collar's presence was a reminder of a painful story he could never fully tell. I gently pulled it from the earth, the metal tags clinking against one another. My name, half rubbed off, was still faintly visible. I let out a shaky breath. Tears welled up, partly from the biting cold, partly from the intense emotions flooding me. I stroked Milo's head, whispering, "Thank you for showing me." It felt like he'd led me to the last piece of the puzzle, some final closure. Perhaps he'd managed to escape from whoever had him, lost his collar in the process, and in some moment of chance or desperation, it ended up in that spot by the willow. We might never know precisely how or why, but holding that collar was like holding a piece of the past that had come full circle. When I brought it inside, my parents started, wide-eyed. Mom covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her face. Dad set his jaw, blinking hard. We all knew the significance of it. It was the last remnant of the day he vanished, something we had believed would never be found. Mom wiped her tears and said, her voice trembling, "This is a sign. It's time to let go of the pain and truly embrace having him back." And that was exactly what happened. We took that collar and hung it in a shadow box, along with a favorite photo of Milo as a puppy and another of him now. We displayed it in our living room as a testament to the miracle of his return, a reminder of hope surviving against the odds. In the months that followed, we continued to care for Milo like the cherished family member he was and always would be. The scars on his body began to fade, and the tension in his muscles eased. He grew stronger, more confident, more trusting again. As time passed, the extraordinary became everyday. Milo was simply our dog, healthy, happy, part of every family dinner, every lazy Sunday morning. But not a day went by that I didn't remember the gift we'd been given. When I'd clip on his new collar for a walk, I'd take a moment to appreciate his wagging tail, the way his ears perked up at the sound of my voice. At night, when he'd curl up at the foot of my bed, I'd whisper a silent "thank you" into the darkness. Now, if there's a moral to this story, it's the same one I've felt echoing in my heart every day since Milo's return. Hope is never truly lost, even when the world seems determined to convince you otherwise. Sometimes, what you've been longing for will walk right up your driveway when you least expect it. And perhaps in the process, it'll bring you back pieces of yourself you thought you'd buried. You might be wondering if there's some grand, cosmic reason Milo returned when he did, or how he traversed the labyrinth of time and distance to find his way back to us. I can't say I have all the answers. Some stories remain partially shrouded, leaving us to fill in the gaps with faith and gratitude. What I do know is that his homecoming was more than a random coincidence. It was a reminder that life can surprise us, that love can persist through unimaginable barriers, and that sometimes, even after the darkest winter, spring can bring about miracles we'd stopped believing in. Each morning when I head into the kitchen, I see the shadow box on the wall, Milo's old collar, the pictures capturing his radiant spirit. I see him at my feet, tail wagging, a living testament to the resilience of the heart. And I smile, feeling a warmth that transcends words. He has changed us all, made us kinder, more aware of the fragile nature of happiness, and more determined to protect it. Losing Milo broke something in me that I was certain I'd never mend. His return reminded me that shattered pieces can come together to form something stronger than before. Not every lost dog finds its way home. I know that. But this one did. And because of that, I'll never stop telling this story to those who need a glimmer of hope. Because sometimes that's all it takes, a single story of the impossible made real, to keep someone else's faith alive. So here we are. We are a family that lost our dog 5 years ago. Then one day, out of the blue, he showed up. It wasn't a perfect reunion. It was tinged with heartache, confusion, and questions that never fully resolved. But it was a second chance we never dreamed we'd receive. And every time I catch Milo dozing in a patch of sunlight or trotting around the backyard sniffing at windblown leaves, I remember that precious truth. Nothing in life is guaranteed. Love each other fiercely while you can, and never underestimate the resilience that lies within the smallest, scruffiest being. Because miracles do happen. Milo is proof of that. And for as long as we have him by our side, we will cherish every wag of his tail as a gift we once thought was lost forever.